Hello.
Welcome to our little tribe.
Yes, I guess
We are
so.
vicious raiders and thieves.
Well, I mean, kind of.
Well, yeah, I mean, who isn't in this society, right?
Yeah, I guess we do live in a society.
Um,
Hello.
Hi to you. And am I talking to a witch or an atheist? And hello, Karak. I hope that's how you pronounce your name. That's how I'm going to pronounce it because I pronounce full vowels.
Hmm.
So tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about getting started, like kind of what sources we use, where we get our information from, that sort of stuff. Would you like to start, Thomas?
Yes. Because I am focused mainly on on Hellenic and Sumerian traditions. Uh, the the sources that I use for Hellenic research, there's this great website called theoi.com. I'm going to post this link in the chat. And there's another great website by one of our Twitter colleagues. The website is called Hellenic Faith, and there are some also pretty good things on there. Uh, and as well as those websites, various philosophical and theological works. There's Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, which is very good, as well as Elements of Theology by Proclus. Uh, and for and for the Sumerian side, I go for the um, I don't have it with me right now, but it's a book that encompasses or that has translations for the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, which is the Sumerian, the Babylonian Epic of Creation, as well as the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then there's another book.
There's also the
Uh,
ETL, the ETSCL, which is the Electronic Corpus of Sumerian
yes,
Literature.
yes.
That's also a really good source. That's actually a primary source
Mhm,
where we can go and we
yes.
can start extrapolating like omens, various ways to worship the gods,
Mhm.
like the myth of Inanna and Ebich,
Yeah,
which is basically where Inanna destroys a mountain because the mountain doesn't properly bow to her.
mhm,
And so, for example, that is something we can extrapolate various like rituals and various religious acts. This is sort of the revivalist part of paganism, bringing these traditions back.
mhm,
Well, not even necessarily back, making new traditions, new ways to honor the gods.
mhm. Because it is because we live in a fundamentally different world uh, than the world of these traditions that we are that we are learning from. So it's important to reconstruct these ancient religions into a modern frame
Framework.
of reference. Yeah, a modern framework.
Yeah, we can't
Because
go around sacrificing people like we did in the olden days, though sometimes
yeah,
pretty
yeah, we yeah, it can be also pretty expensive to sacrifice a whole ton of oxen, for instance.
not to
So
mention the animal abuse part.
yeah.
But funny enough, there are some people we can't. When you hear animal sacrifice, it doesn't always mean like slaughtering a bull on an altar.
Mhm,
For some pagans, what it can mean more instead of is hunting for food, and you dedicate that food after you kill the animal for the food. You dedicate that food to a particular deity before you
yes.
eat it. So when
Yes.
you hear pagans talk about like animal sacrifice, that's generally what they mean in an American context. Now, in say an African context or in an Asian context, then yeah, things can be a bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Animal sacrifice is still a thing over in those cultures.
Yeah. Calon, could you post the link of the electronic text corpus of
Yeah, I'll hand it to Rue to put in the description after the stream.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that'll be good as well, so that the viewers who are watching this right now
for the
could
electronic corpus
go.
that it's not exactly the easiest thing to use, and sometimes it can be hard to trace like which tablets come from which time period. Because what you have to keep in mind for Sumerian is that we're talking about a civilization that lasted over 1,000 years and is also older than Troy.
Yes.
By like almost 2,000 years. I think, what was it? Ilium fell back in 1111 BC.
Yeah.
Or thereabouts. Sumeria was around since 4000 BC.
Yeah, especially the cities of Eridu and Uruk. Those were...
Unu is actually what it was called apparently in Sumerian.
Not Uruk?
Uruk is a Akkadian word.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, Sumerian in general seems to have preferred open syllables.
Huh.
Like, open syllables are like liquids at the end of their, so like, for example, you have Rhuagh, which is literally, by the way, 2 words. It means king, but what it literally means when you parse it out is Rhu and Gah, which means big man.
Okay.
Which is kind of a funny fact. Or like A, which means like a temple and a house and whatnot. Egal is like a big, like, or a large temple or a sanctuary, I think.
Yeah.
I recall. Very painfully, actually. It's not an easy thing to start.
Yeah.
Especially in a Sumerian context, because, like, for example, if you want to learn, like, the Sumerian languages, all the resources out there are extremely technical.
Yeah.
There are, like, 2 free grammars online that I can find for Sumerian, and both of them are, like, 780 pages.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't really remember how I found these websites that I've linked. I just came upon them when I was just doing research into Hellenic polytheism, and
also called Hellenismus.
Yes, but I think that these are very good websites to. Theoi goes into more of the myths themselves of each particular deity or other kind of divine being, like the heroes, and then Hellenic faith goes into more of the philosophical and theological perspective of things.
Yeah, and that's also more from like also a revivalist sort of idea. Yes. And that's the other thing also, especially for like speaking as a heathen, it's almost kind of jealous about how much we actually have in terms of Greco-Roman stuff.
Yeah.
Because for the Norse, we have to extrapolate a lot. Our text, the closest text that we get, were written like 100 years after, or 200 years after the conversion of Iceland, which was the last place to be converted.
Yeah. So
Christianity. And there are some gods, like, for example, Forseti. Forseti is like a god. He has his holding Glitnir. But in a text called Grimnismal, which is the tale of Grimnir, is basically where Odin gets trapped. in a fire, and then a young boy brings him a horn of mead, and he recites a lot of mythic lore. But that's the only place he's mentioned in, and it's mentioned that he did some sort of judgment, but what judgment exactly he did, we kind of don't really know because of the Norse weren't really ones for writing their stuff down.
Or the places where they wrote stuff down just deteriorated, or were destroyed by Christians.
That's why also a lot of it. We also try to reconstruct like the place names. So, like for example, I think Odin. For example, Odense, which is in modern Denmark, is actually a syncopation of the word Oldensve. A ve is like a open air is like an open air site for worship. A lot of times these areas would also be like enclosed with what's called a vebolt. So like sacred ropes. Yeah, as it turns out, for the Germanic people, what they like to do rather than strictly putting like up carvings and whatnot is they would dedicate like various natural areas to the gods. I don't know if something similar. I think something similar happened to in the Hellenic traditions, though they also have a bunch of minor deities with which those places would be associated with.
Yeah, there are many places in the ancient Roman world where there were specific places where deities were supposed to have resided. One of the places, most beautiful places I've ever been to, in the town of Tivoli, just outside of Rome, they have a temple. They have a temple of Tiburtus, who's the mythical founder of Tibur, which is now modern day Tivoli. You can think of Tiburtus as somewhat like Romulus and Remus for the Romans. And in fact, Tiburtus was referenced in Virgil's Aeneid.
Yeah. Which, for those who don't know, the Aeneid is basically about the forefathers of the Romans. It's a mythical account of the travels of Aeneas.
Yeah,
basically, they saw coming from Troia in order to give them a sort of epic connection to basically the Greeks. Well, not even so much the Greeks, but to like Homer and whatnot, because Greek education was a high symbol of status in ancient Rome.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Triatiel asks, how can you tell when something you're reading has been distorted? One good way to find that out is basically looking at when that piece of work was written, and looking at sort of the historical context of that, because it wasn't until the 1st and 2nd centuries CE when Christianity started spreading. So basically anything before that time period would generally be not distorted. So again, these would be all of the ancient Greek philosophers, a large portion of the ancient Roman philosophers like Cicero, Lucretius, and Apuleius. However, later on in the 4th and 5th centuries, you still have some pagan polytheist writers, most notably Porphyry Plotinus, Plotinus was third century.
Yeah, and
Uh, yeah, uh, and a lot of them were very critical of Christianity. So when they put forth interpretations of myths, you can generally say that that is as undistorted as it can be. Because if it was mentioned primarily by a Christian philosopher, then you might get a lot of distortions by equating specific deities from the ancient Greek and ancient Roman world with God, the very specifically the Christian God.
right,
Yeah.
and from a like sort of heathen perspective, this is actually a bit more difficult of a problem since since none of that, the stuff that the Hellenics have and whatnot, none of that survived.
Well, wait. What do you mean? None of that survived? Yeah.
For heathenry. So for
Oh,
like
for heathenry, yeah. I blanked.
yeah, no, for heathenry we don't have that.
Yeah.
Well, we do have except I say none of it survived. We do have Tacitus.
Yes.
Who wrote De Germania
Yes.
about the Germans, and he's one of the people who first mentions Nertus, which
Yes.
we think, which we think may be a early version. I've read somewhere that we may be an early version of the god North,
Okay.
who is a Vanir.
Mhm.
But a lot of what we have to do in order to get as close as we can is we have to compare the various texts, not only to sort of like Christian myths, but we also, one of the ways we can do it is the place names. So like, for example, one of the reasons we know that Odin is probably a sort of later invention is because we look at the distribution of their names. So we look at the distribution of places named after Thor, Rhuagh, and Odin. Well, Odin mostly appears in like the south, sort of around Denmark area. And he seems to sort of come in at a later time, whereas in like, I think, what is it, Eastern Sweden, we mostly see Thor. And in Iceland, it's almost exclusively Thor. So we can do that, and we can see sort of the distribution of where these gods were worshipped. The other way we do it is through cross mythological comparison. So, like, for example, Athumba, I think it's Athumba, who is the primordial cow that feeds, that the gods sort of, that, well, for one, licks the salt or licks the primordial rime up in the creation myth for Norse mythology. That tends to be a common feature across Indo-European mythologies. I think Thor is another element who is similar. He's similar, for example, to Perun. Perun is, for those who don't know, a Slavic deity. Which, by the way, probably the two groups that we don't have much material for tend to be the Celts and the Slavs. I think even the Slavs got it a little bit worse than either of the rest of us did.
Yeah.
We were practically annihilated.
Yeah. Something that else that I should mention is that a lot of mentions of foreign of deities of foreign peoples have basically relabeled as other deities, like
usually, like for example, Saint Brigitte is actually a goddess, Brigitte.
Yeah.
Who was a goddess of like healing and fertility. She was so popular that instead of trying to go through the effort to stamp her out, the Christians just made her a saint. I think the same happened with Velesh and Perun. from what I recall. The other method we can do, and a little bit more interesting, is that we can look at the philology as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we can trace back and sort of see, like, what are the etymologies of these gods' names.
Mm-hmm.
Like Odin, for example, comes from Woldenas,
Mm-hmm.
from Proto-Germanic, which is like kind of like rage and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And Thunras is obviously what became of Thor, and Uller, who is actually a very popular god in the Viking Age, yet does not at all show up in Norse mythology, funny enough. When we look at his name and we trace it back, we get, I think it's Wolfraz, which is like glory. So we think that he was probably like a god of like glory and power and whatnot. We know he held some sort of important position in the Norse world. We just aren't quite sure what it is. In fact, primarily because he's not mentioned at most. Well, I didn't say at all. He's mentioned once as even taking the place of Odin when Odin was outlawed. So, yeah, he is mentioned once, but other than that, we don't know much about him. But he was still a popular deity.
Mm-hmm.
And we wouldn't know that if it weren't for place names.
Mm-hmm. Along this, sorry, Rhuagh, you were going to say? What do you mean by blending in that sense? Are you talking about a kind of syncretism there? I'm sort of unsure what that question is actually asking. Yeah, but one thing I was going to say is that um, specifically with regards to the Hellenic context, and I'm kind of including Roman and quasi-Roman polytheism in here. So including various cults like the cult of Isis, the cult of Mithras. Um,
Mithras.
yeah, in that context, you have something known as interpretatio Graeca or interpretatio Romana, where basically they call other deities from other cultures basically the same names. So in Calon mentioned Tacitus's Germania. He, I believe, refers to Thor as Mercury. Am I correct on that,
No,
Calon?
it was Odin.
What?
No, he refers to Odin as Mercury.
Oh, okay. Odin as Mercury and Jupiter or Jupiter as Thor. Am I correct on that also?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you get that same kind of thing with other cultures. Like in the Canaanite or the Syrian context, I believe the god Baal was referred to as Zeus. In fact, went when I was in Italy, I mentioned that a little bit ago. When I was in Italy, I went to a museum there, and they had an altar that said Zeus Hadad, and Hadad is referencing Baal Hadad.
Baal Hadad.
Yeah.
Baal Hadad was he is a god of the Canaanites.
Mm-hmm.
But they have Hadad as opposed to Baal Hamon. Baal itself is actually a title, means Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you have Baal Hadad and Baal Hamon. Baal Hamon was the god of Carthage.
Yeah. But I think this altar was actually from ancient Palestine or ancient Syria or ancient Phoenicia. Uh, so one atheist, one witch clarified their comment saying Irish and Cherokee that resulted in Appalachian folk magic traditions. That is definitely not in my area of expertise. I'm not the person to answer that question. Do you know anything, Calon, about that?
About what? Sorry.
From the chat, one atheist, one witch clarified their comment.
What did they say?
Uh,
Look into Appalachian folk medicine, especially around the North Carolina area. There's also a work by James Moody, who gave sort of a mythological account. Wrote that basically went around and wrote down a bunch of Cherokee mythos about like the Thunder Twins and whatnot. It's a little bit biased, but it's going to be it's a great starting place for looking into Cherokee lore, and by extension, if you cross-reference that with various like books on Appalachian folklore, you should be able to establish a tradition there.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
The only problem is those kinds of books tend to only be available in Appalachia or in like Cherokee County, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something that I should mention kind of relating to that is a lot of these works where we get a lot of our sources can be rather difficult to come by and maybe unavailable for a lot of people. I've seen books of these texts going for upwards of 50 to more than $100, but because of that, I think that these online sources are very important for us to actually have have a greater amount of people who can research.
Yeah, they can be, and ultimately, the best sources are the primary sources.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, any other questions?
Mm-hmm.
That we will be building in the near future. So also watch out for that if you're interested. We'll be trying to divide it a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yes, those are birds and dogs that you hear. Sorry, but they just want to be heard. Okay, don't judge them. They just want to be heard.
I see. Yes.
But yeah, what other questions are there?
Let's see.
So Raving Pariah, which two groups have you never heard of? Heathens or Hellenics? Heathens, I admit, can be not exactly the easiest to come by at times, but yeah.
And neither are Hellenics, because largely Hellenic polytheism is centered around the Greek identity. So a lot of people who practice it in the United States, for example, are from the Greek diaspora or whose family immigrated from Greece. So I consider Hellenics as being harder to come by because other traditions like heathenry and certain forms of Wicca are a lot more popular.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All sorts of resources and all sorts of fun. Yet being a pagan and moving forward with this it's not easy.
Yeah.
Reviving dead traditions actually turns out to be hard work.
Yeah. And one thing that I've been told by various people at various pagan events that I've been to, they've told me that it can be hard to decouple this inherently monotheistic understanding from our own understanding. So it may so if you develop certain ideas based off of these ancient religions that you're trying to look to, then and you basically need to sort of unlearn thinking in a monotheistic
Yeah,
reference.
that's if you're ever a monotheist. I mean, for me, monotheism is weird. It's like, huh?
Mm-hmm.
You attribute all these phenomena to just one God? What?
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, that's one of the two big problems with monotheism. The first one is similar to what Calon just said, where where they attribute all of they may attribute all of the qualities and the experiences of different deities to a singular god, or the other way,
or they just deny them.
Yeah, or they just deny them, or they just yes, very much so.
Oh, by the way, we also have another question from Roving Pariah. Do you specifically avoid Nazi and far right-wing groups while researching paganism? Yes, we do, because anything that the Nazis touch is compromised.
Yeah.
How? Basically, the way we do it is, one, we always check our sources.
Yes.
Two, there are certain symbols that the far right uses that are ahistorical. So, like the black sun that appeared on the in Wolfsburg in Heinrich Himmler's castle. As soon as we see that, which is basically a bunch of sigma runes in the shape of a sun, as soon as we see that, we immediately know that, okay, either this website or this document associates with Nazis.
Yeah, and
one, that's a historical symbol.
Mm-hmm.
And two, Nazism never did anything for heathenry. They racialized it.
Mm-hmm.
I think Heinrich Himmler, he was involved with the occult and whatnot. So all of his trash is basically what we would call propaganda, based on building of what was called the Deutsche Volk.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, it's very frustrating because whenever we go to look at for art and whatnot for heathenry, we constantly have to check the entire store and make sure they aren't selling Nazi symbols.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, if you do find a website that that purports to be discussing any kind of paganism, you need to look at the author or the creator of that website to see if they have made racially charged statements in the past, and if they are associated with any kind of right-wing groups. And so I always want to look for I always want to go through the primary sources themselves, because then we aren't then we can't go through Nazis in the process. Although that can be difficult, like Calon said a little while ago, there may be very few sources, or if any, that exist pertaining to these ancient traditions.
And avoiding the far right is one of the reasons, well, aside from the fact that it's original, is why I always tend to go to the source documents.
Yes.
Going to the source documents is really the best way to start building up with paganism.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like rituals and whatnot. As for theological interpretation, that gets a little bit tricky, and that we'll cover in a bit of a later stream.
Yeah. Let's see. Roving Parish I just posted another question saying, then why do Nazis and far right groups believe if it's not meant to be racialized or nativized, since I don't think it was for paganism back then, I believe. Basically, the way that modern people think of race is entirely foreign to how ancient people thought of others.
So basically, I can speak also to this with a background in sociology. Racial formation as itself is a very arbitrary process, and it's fluid and it moves over time. Like, for example, the Vikings dealt with Arabs. They also dealt with Greeks, who would not have been really of the same skin color as they were, nor had the same features.
Mm-hmm.
And they also intermarried with Slavs. For example, the Rus, who would be the tribe that would go on to become Russia, were not originally a Slavic tribe. They were a Norse tribe. Mm-hmm. They intermarried with the Slavic tribe, and eventually the tribe became Slavicized, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So our concept of race with skin color is a relatively recent phenomenon that is a product of the slave trade.
Yeah.
Where the reason why they chose black people is because black people were easier to tell apart than Irish indentured servants. Add to that a dehumanizing law that allowed people to own blacks, and you basically had a one-stop recipe for keeping slaves in line.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where our modern concept in the United States of race emerged. This is also what...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and British racism, imperialism, all that kind of stuff is very fine. But yeah, in short, original pagans did not have the same racial classifications that we had.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure the Romans would look at the Greeks, and they would probably, talk among themselves. They would say, "Oh, this is a Greek trait," or "That's a Greek trait," and they had their biases, sure, but they didn't have like a bias necessarily towards skin color.
Mm-hmm.
Our modern concept of race would be weird to them and be like, what?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hey, you all hear me?
Oh, hi, Via.
Hello.
Okay, awesome.
Welcome back, Via.
We're glad to have you.
We're talking about race.
Oh, yay. Always a fun subject.
It's a light subject,
Yeah.
Very light.
Nice to just sit back in a wooden rocking chair on the porch and listen to the breeze go by.
Roving. So when it comes to like discriminatory, they didn't think in terms of like nation states really back then. At least depending on the era that you were in, it was more centered around, at least in ancient Greece, the polis, your city-state. And originally it was that way for Rome too, and then Rome decided to expand. And eventually Rome subjugated all the other cities. So it was more identity by the city, but over time, as the Roman Empire grew, their came to sort of solidify this sort of pan-Italic identity. It wasn't, you stopped seeing, like, for example, Romans considering Sabines or the Etruscans to be somewhat different than just your average Roman citizen.
Or the Samnites.
Yeah, or the Samnites.
And with regards to the Greeks, they had the word barbaros, which is where we got the word barbarian from, and they thought that someone from North Africa and ancient Celtic tribes, they were equally barbarians to them.
Barbaroi. Mm-hmm.
Barbaroi, yes.
But yeah, so no, still a foreign concept. Also, the Greek city-states really hated each other.
Yeah.
That was a whole huge thing.
They had multiple wars with each other.
Have to be. All right, we'll see you 1 pagan. I'm 1 atheist, not 1 pagan. Thank you for stopping by. But
yeah, we're glad to have you on.
Yeah, far right groups are they appropriated so many of our symbols. Like I can't like wearing an odaru would probably get me in trouble in Germany.
Yeah.
Odal is the rune for like ancestry and whatnot.
Yeah.
As well as home. Or Tewaz. Tewaz is a symbol of Tyr.
Yeah. Reverend Pariah says, okay, thank you for your answer. I want to learn more about paganism, but don't want to be accidentally get into contact with white supremacists as a black person. That is very much something that you have to deal with, but it's important to know that
so roving pagan as a black person, here's what I recommend. Start looking into Kemetic traditions as well as Yoruban traditions.
Yeah.
Those two traditions will be safe for you. As for heathenry,
it's hard to have white,
you're going to have to
white supremacist when you're in African religion. It's hard to have white supremacists in an African religion.
Hard, but I wouldn't put it past someone.
Yeah.
But anyhow, so start with that, and then the Kemetic, in Kemetic polytheism, and then start working your way that way. Because a lot of times, the benefit you would have is mainly through networking. So if you meet a Kemetic pagan or Yoruban, which Yorubans, I mean, I don't know if Yoruba is a living polytheistic tradition. They never had to deal with full-on extinction. There are traditions, but let's say if you meet a Kemetic pagan and they know a heathen, you can generally at least be somewhat confident that that heathen is not going to be what we call a folkist.
Yeah, the most notable folkist organization is the Asatru Folk Assembly, the AFA, headed by a white supremacist by the name of Stephen McNallen. You want to steer clear from them and anyone who associates with them. Although that's primarily from heathenry.
And we call that Declaration 27, which is taken from a passage in Hobomov.
Yes. Declaration 127. Yes.
Also, you can always look into our Discord. We ban folkists. We don't allow folkists or any far-right people onto our Discord. No focus has showed up yet. And if you want to, I can also provide you contact with another pagan, another heathen, who I can promise you is not a folkist.
Banning folkists is fun. I had to do it a couple times on another Discord server.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're fun. Well, actually, no. I'm just being facetious.
It's fun to ban them and rain down hell upon them.
It really is. It's satisfying. What's also satisfying is Yeah. Eventually, we'll cover why their theology is screwed up beyond belief. They basically just reduce the gods to ethnicities. A lot of them aren't even actually pagan. They don't believe in the gods. They're LARPers.
Yeah.
And Roving Pariah, if I remember right, Yoruba has been heavily syncretized with Christianity and
it has in the New World.
Vodou. Yeah.
In the New World, it was syncretized with Voodoo, Mayombe, and Santeria is where, but you still to this day, you can go and you can talk to a high priest of Shango. And you can still consult a Babalawo for the concerning the Ifa, which is basically going to a priest for divination.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm not saying that the religion hasn't changed. I'm saying though that they haven't. They were never really completely wiped out.
Mm-hmm. Something else that I should mention is that if you are on the lookout for a potential focus, if any of them talk a lot about things like their own race, if they talk about if they talk about
blood and soil, then
yes,
they're probably
blood and soil. By the way, is not a pagan notion. It's actually a Nazi notion. It's Blut und Bolden, and it was created by the Nazis to try to give some sort of mystical connection between a farmer and his land, because basically what the Nazis wanted to do is they wanted to go back to feudal times.
Mm-hmm.
And be with a totalitarian structure. You have like the Gauleiter and the and so forth in the Goya. And so one of the ways you have to do that, especially in a country where they have food shortage problems, which was the whole reason pretty much for the invasion of the Soviet Union, is to propagandize the farming process, glamorize it, and various things of that nature. And Blut und Bolden was a way to do that. But outside of Nazi context, blood and soil does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is you'll see people labeling themselves Asatru, and generally most Norse heathens wouldn't self-identify with that term. So it's not a sure thing, but it is kind of almost a dog whistle to look out for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I, as a Norse heathen myself, I don't say I am Osatru, which, by the way, it comes from the term os, which is like a singular for a god, like as a group for the Asir, and Tru, which is like faith, so like literally faith to the old gods, which is not really a term I like. So I don't really identify with it, even though I do use some Osatru practices myself. It's not something I overtly identify. I'll say I'm a Norse pagan before I say I'm Osatru.
Mm-hmm.
And also, the folk assembly can go fuck itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we shouldn't go much further with regards to folkism, but the last thing I'll say on that is that by attributing individual gods with specific people, you end up getting into some really strange theological problems, like basically artificially limiting the gods themselves to only operating with specific people, which isn't necessarily correct.
And it's historically completely fucked, because there's documented like trade of religion and ideas between the Viking Age Scandinavians and multiple other civilizations, including the Middle Eastern Muslims, Christians, other forms of pagans,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
they even got their gods from the Germanic pantheon. And without the Germanic pantheon first, then there wouldn't be Norse heathenry.
Mm-hmm. Which is indeed only one kind of heathenry. There's also Anglo-Saxon, continental, and various other fun little forms. So long as it's not focused, it's okay.
Hmm.
When it's focused, it's crystal pagan. Yeah, they're also historical. Like we found burials where statues of Thor are right beside a statue of Christ. Christ was what? Oh yeah, they had to.
Although they didn't coexist for much longer.
They didn't coexist forever, but you would have like the Christian sort of persecution myth that there was widespread persecution is false. The persecution itself was actually more localized.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Christians, they went to church and pagans went to their temple, and that was about it.
Mm-hmm. But then you got, in the 4th and 5th centuries, you then see various Christians becoming very, very evangelical and destroying or burning various temples. The best example of this would be the Serapeum in Alexandria, in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also the Irmusol.
Yes.
For the Anglo-Saxon heathens.
Christians did the whole burning churches down thing first.
Hey, raid's a raid.
Yeah.
Right. Live chat.
Not that I'm seeing so far. Mm-hmm.
Like the first step in terms of getting into polytheism, paganism, that sort of thing?
I'd say talking to pagans. That's how I started educating myself, and I think it's gone pretty well.
Yeah, there are various introductory things that you could do. I would actually suggest that if there is a particular deity or particular deities uh, that you feel attached to, then uh, instead of then instead of reading all of the myths first, I'd suggest building or making a little shrine for them in order to sort of get started um, in that sort of ritual prayer mindset.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so talking to pagans, reading up on mythos, that's also a good step.
Mm-hmm.
Finding local roots if you can, and yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty much all you can do.
Mm-hmm. If anyone is in the New York metropolitan area, there is a Hellenic polytheist group called the YSEE. That is very good, and they welcome anyone who wishes to worship the various Hellenic gods, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, and race. So they're very welcoming.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Other than that, we're a pretty decentralized group because, yeah, a lot of us still actually experience a lot of oppression and whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the South.
Mm-hmm.
Being a sovereign pagan.
It's southern U.S.
Yeah, southern U.S.
The one in the not the one in the Olympics. Yeah.
Like you guys are always.
Well, you're the only European here. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lots
Yeah.
of places will spend an entire, lots of places in the US will spend an entire semester of a 2-semester geography class just talking about US geography.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But anyhow, if there are no more questions, then I think we can move to the after show.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I can quickly adjust that before we. Yes, our link is in the description. I'll also be posting it on our Twitter. That is at poly_ology on
Mm-hmm.
Twitter.
And if any of you have, oh yes, if
There's
any of you have any further questions, you can ask any of us on Twitter.
on Twitter, on Discord, in the description or in the doobly-doo,
Yes.
and then we will see you all hopefully in the comments.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully I'll see you all there.
All
Mm-hmm.
right. And with that, we'll say goodnight. Thank you everybody for coming. Don't forget to like, share, do all the things, and we will see you all next time. Bye bye.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.